So in this video, we are going to install MySQL and get that up and running with our Laravel application. So first thing we're going to do is just sudo apt-get update, and that'll ask me for my password because I'm logged in as user Forge now, who can use sudo commands but requires a password for most commands. So that is done, and I can do apt-get install -y MySQL server. So I'm not going to try to get a repository to get the latest MySQL server. The 5.7 version on the server here is a pretty decently new one. You can get a very, very new one if you want from MySQL's homepage, from MySQL's site. I typically don't bother. So installing MySQL server is also going to get you MySQL client, so you can log into it. It's just a dependency, so I just usually typically say get MySQL server. Now during this, we're going to get a prompt for a password. There is a way to install this without a prompt, and I have some videos on serversforhackers.com on that. So if you're curious about that and automating the installation of MySQL, you can definitely check out those videos. Here, I'm just going to create the password root for the server because it's quick and easy, and I'm just going to destroy the server when I'm done. But you should put in a long, complicated password there in a production environment. All right, so that's done, and MySQL is running. The next thing I usually run is MySQL and secure installation, which just prompts us for a bunch of stuff. So it's going to ask me for password root. I'm going to give it to it, and then I can do a bunch of stuff. So I don't actually use the validate password plugin, which I believe checks for the strength of the password, and I think it also sets passwords to expire. I'm not positive. I'm just going to set this to no. I'm going to use secure passwords, and this is a good way to enforce that, but I'm going to skip it for this video because I know my root user is going to have a bad password here. So do I want to change the root password? I don't in this case. You might want to in yours. And actually, I should mention that we are prompted for a password and create one on an install on Debian and Ubuntu servers, but on Red Hat and CentOS servers, you're not. So this is an important step on those servers where you should create a root password using this command. All right, anyway, do I want to remove anonymous users? I do. If I want to disallow remote login remotely, I do. I don't think that's enabled actually, but I'll say yes here anyway. Remove test databases, yes. Our flush privileges to reload them, yes. So let's check that out. MySQL-u root-p, and I'll put in my password. And we can see the test database in here is gone. And if I select user host from MySQL, the database named MySQL, and the table named user that has users in it, we'll see we have what users can log in, which right now are the default system and maintenance ones, but also user root and only from localhost. All of these users can only log in from host to localhost. Great. So I want to keep this that way. So there are only users who can log in over localhost. And then actually, if I edit the configuration, etc MySQL, where most configuration here is, and mysql.conf.d, and there will be a mysql.conf file in here. We'll see MySQL is binding and listening in two places. One, it starts up a socket file. So just like PHP-7.1, it's using a socket file to listen for connections, but it's also binding to the TCP network, not just a Unix socket, but also the TCP network, and that is the localhost network. So MySQL here is only allowing local connections because Unix sockets are only local because they're filed in the local file system, and this only binds to the loopback network interface, which is only available locally on the server. So MySQL right now can't accept remote connections, and we're going to keep it that way for this series. I do have videos, once again, as I mentioned, on other MySQL stuff, including connecting remotely, if you want to check those out as well. All right, so I'm going to log back into MySQL, and we are going to create a new database and then a new user, and then set the privileges for that user so that our application can connect as well with a user that's not user root. So I'm going to create a database, and I'll just call it my app, and I'll set the default character set to UTF-8 MB4, which I definitely recommend. The MB4 version of this is a more complete character set implementation of UTF-8. It allows you to do 4-bit characters like emojis in your database and just other non-Latin alphabets, which might also have 4-bit length characters instead of the typical 1 or 3. This is better than just the UTF-8 character set, which has a maximum of 3-bit characters. Okay, so we have a database. Now we need to make a user. So I'm going to create user, and I'm going to call it my user. And usernames in MySQL aren't just the username, but combinations of usernames and host names. So we set a username, and then we say what host that user is allowed to connect from. And in our case, only localhost. We only want this user to be able to connect to MySQL locally as an additional layer of security on top of the fact that MySQL is only binding to a localhost networks anyway, so it could really have a double set of security there. Now, if you do open your MySQL up to remote connections, it's also important to create a new user to be able to be connected to from some remote host name or IP address. But in our case, we can just get away with localhost, and then I can set a password by saying identified by, and we can do some super secret password. Again, it should be long and complex in production, but I'm going to do a password secret here because this is not a production server. All right, so we created a database, we created a user. Now we have to give permissions for that user to affect this database. So I'm going to say grant all privileges, and we're going to give all privileges. I'm not going to lock it down to specific ones. And I'm going to say on the database my app, and specifically to all tables on the database my app, and I'm going to give those to the user we created named my user at localhost. Remember, you always have to say the user and host name when identifying a user in a SQL query. Okay, so that's done. I'll do flush privileges, and this will tell MySQL to flush the cached version of privileges that it holds in RAM and exit. So we should be able to log in as my user using the password secret, and we can do show databases, and we'll only see the information schema that all users have access to, but also my app, the only database that my user has access to as well. Okay, great. So let's go to our application here named my app, and we can edit the .m file, and we'll set MySQL. It's already set to the correct host name. It's set to the port. The database name we named my app. The user we named my user, and I'll save and quit this. And in my app, I'm going to do PHP artisan make auth so we can get our authentication scaffolding. And then I'll do PHP artisan migrate, and this should successfully run the migrations, and it does. So we know we actually did connect to that database correctly. So now I can see if I refresh this page, our register and login. So if I wanted to create a user, I'll do Chris at serversforhackers.com. Oops, of course I have to do the right fields. And I registered, great. So then I can log out. I'll head back here, we'll check out MySQL, and I'll use the database named my app, and I'll select star from users, and we should see a new user here. My Chris at serversforhackers.com user. Perfect. So we have database connections and it's all set. The very last thing I'm going to show you is just to reinforce the idea I talked about where we have a Unix socket bound to and the local networks bound to. So I'm going to head to that configuration we checked out, and let me do ifconfig quick. I'm going to get the private IP address of this server, and that's the public one. This is the private IP address of the server. And then I'm going to edit the my.conf file here. And where it says bind address, I'm going to not bind to the localhost network, but to the private network IP address. This will technically allow connections to MySQL from other servers in the private network. And because I'm in a DigitalOcean droplet, that technically means everyone inside of the same data center as me, whether it's my account or not. So it's not something you definitely want to do unless you are also going to lock down the firewalls on your server. So I'm just doing this to show a point here. So that's done. I'll do sudo service. Actually, before I do that change, this change is not sucked in yet. We can do MySQL-u root-p and log in as user root. And if I change that to MySQL, and I'll do -h so I can define the host specifically and user root, the password, I can also log in. So if I do sudo service MySQL restart, this will change. So when I don't define the host in MySQL, it's defaulting to localhost, which is the Unix socket file. So localhost in MySQL refers to the Unix socket file when we're logging in. Now, if I do -host and I do 127.0.0.1, this is no longer connecting over the Unix socket file, it's connecting over the TCP network for the local network. And this should not work because it's no longer listening on that because we changed that bind address. If instead I tried to log in over the private network address, this technically will work, except user root is not allowed to log in from this host, so I'm not allowed in, but I was able to connect to MySQL there, and then MySQL is able to reject me because user root isn't allowed to log in there. So if I do MySQL again, oops, I have to put in as user root and password root, I can actually create user root at that IP address. So I can say create user root, and I'll say the IP address it's allowed to connect to, identified by root, and then I can do select user host from MySQL.user. And we'll see now we have all our users listed here. So we have the my user at localhost that's allowed to connect, and root is now allowed to connect from that private network, the local private network. Then I could test this out and log in as user root, and that then works. So we have two things going on here. One is that MySQL is bound to the private network instead of the loopback 127.0.0.1 network. So you can only log in via this IP address or over localhost, which is the Unix socket. It's not 127.0.0.1. And then we have that second layer of security where users are only able to log into from a specific network. So localhost for my user, and now root can log in as from localhost or over the private network as well. So if you're on a Linode and DigitalOcean server, I don't really suggest you open your MySQL up to the local private network unless you are accepting connections from other servers within your account, and you have also set up firewall rules to only allow connections from specific servers using IP tables or UFW, which is just a wrapper around IP tables. All right, so that's it for MySQL. We saw how to install it, how to set it up, how to make it work with our Laravel application. We talked a little bit about network security with MySQL, and that's all I'm going to cover for MySQL here. In the next video, I'm just going to cover setting up Redis, which is a really quick thing to do.